Um, I'm going to talk a bit about communicating in a remote team. And even though Peter already touched upon the topic with various of his points, I feel like there's quite a lot more to add. But first of all, everyone actually loves remote work. Remote work is great. And it's not just me who's saying that. Lots of people agree. Everyone loves remote work. FYI conducted a survey with 486 participants on remote work. And the remote work report, in the remote work report, people reported that 91% of participants said that working remotely is a great fit for them. And 97% said that they would recommend remote working to a friend. I think that's quite convincing. The report itself is also quite great and has a great tip section, so I would recommend you check it out if you work remotely because it's really useful. But they also asked about what challenges people face when working remotely. And guess what the #1 challenge was? Communication. 27% of all participants said that communication is the biggest problem. But that's not all. Out of the 13 reported challenges, 9 are directly linked to communication. So communication is actually a really, really big problem. And if we look at the list, on top it's communication, but then people also said that social opportunities and loneliness and isolation are big problems for them. Well, that's related to communication. And similarly, organic interaction in the team, visibility in the team, time zones. All of these issues are all somehow related to how communication is done and how it's managed. And that's why I think it's worthwhile spending more time thinking about how we want to structure our communication in remote teams. And because this is such a big problem for people, and I've also struggled with some of these problems myself, I am giving this talk to share of the things that I have learned throughout the years that have worked for me and the teams I've been on. But what is actually difficult here? Because, even in an in-house team, if you're on site, you still have to communicate in a team. That's also not without problems. So what actually makes communication in a remote team hard? Well, for starters, unlike an office, you cannot just walk over to your colleague or call them even if they're in a different time zone. You have to be much more purposeful in your communication. And that is quite different from a water cooler conversation. And this difficulty is especially noticeable in mixed teams that are partially on-site and partially remote, because the on-site employees will have to get used to this change of having to communicate differently with their remote colleagues. But then that's not everything. There are also fewer spontaneous opportunities to socialize. You don't have that water cooler conversation. You cannot just grab lunch with a colleague or have after-work drinks with your team. It just doesn't happen. And oftentimes, if you work remotely, you end up working either from home, which is what the majority of people do, or from a co-working space or coffee shop where you perhaps don't even know anybody. And that can get lonely and quite isolating. But what's more, if you're not visible to your team and you don't interact with them day to day, they might just forget about you. If there are no opportunities for you to present your work, to make yourself visible, then your boss will forget about you when the next promotion is up, or when the opportunities for career growth, maybe for a learning, like a training course, for example. They might just forget about you, and that is a shame, and you should try and avoid that if you're in your remote organization. But as I said before, this is not just a problem in remote teams. All of these things that I said can happen in an on-site team. So the good thing is, communication is also difficult in a regular team, so it's not that much harder to make it work in a remote team. You just have to be purposeful. And so that's why in the next part I'm going to first of all talk about developing a strategy for your remote work, and then talk about a few tactics that I've kind of found for myself that work for me. In terms of strategy, I think the key here is that you as a team or as an organization should together develop or design your communication and how you work together, your processes, in order to enable the best possible result. And in order not to exclude anyone, you should try and design your processes so that the entire company could be fully remote. If the entire company could be fully remote, then it doesn't matter if some employees are on-site or if some employees are in Office A or Office B, because everyone already has all the opportunities they need, no matter where they are, no matter what they do. So what are some tactics to actually implement this? First of all, you should involve everyone and understand what is already working if you're already part of a team and what they want. If you're not part of a team yet, but you're starting work in a new remote team, or perhaps with a remote client as a freelancer, one thing that I try and do is to understand how they prefer to work, what kind of tools they prefer to use, what communication styles do they prefer. Some clients want to have a weekly update call. Other clients want to have daily Slack updates. And others want something different altogether. And it's important to understand what other people want, but also to know what you yourself are comfortable with. You yourself will have a preference. Am I more a person who learns or understands from reading, for example, reports? Or do you prefer spoken communication, perhaps in video calls? That's something you should know for yourself so you can tell your clients and your coworkers what you prefer. The second thing is you should probably overcommunicate. Overcommunication is really important because you cannot just have that water cooler conversation, because you don't have these serendipitous opportunities. You have to write everything down, and you have to communicate everything again and again, and as much as possible, because when we're together in one room, I can see from your gestures and your reactions how you have perceived what I said. But as Peter pointed out, there is no irony on Slack. And other people cannot read your mind. They cannot read your intentions. In written text, that's especially difficult. But even in a video call, it doesn't come across really just as much. So try and be as explicit as possible and communicate as much as possible where it's important. And that kind of touches upon the next thing. You should try and write everything down. The thing is, if you are having a meeting and via video call or even on site in person, and you discuss something and there are no meeting notes, how is any remote employee ever going to figure out what happened in that meeting? If you don't write it down, it's impossible to share that information. And it also makes it very difficult to build a track that people can backtrace. So if someone wants to understand how a decision was made, they would like to see all the steps that have led there. That's really difficult if there are no steps to backtrace. But then it's not just about creating lots of Google Docs, for example, to write notes down, but you should also make them available in some sensible format. So instead of every employee having some Google Docs in some structure in their personal Google Drive or something else, Dropbox, you have to create a system where everyone in the company knows where to put what information. So others can then later on find it. And also you can also find your own documents from like half a year ago. But that's really important because there is no point in writing everything down if nobody can ever read it. Another thing we touched upon, using something like Slack or other chat rooms can really help with the day-to-day speed of communication. While emails and like regular updates or video calls can be useful to portray or to communicate bigger updates, it's very difficult to quickly sort out issues via that unless you're doing video calls all the time. And so having something like Slack available is really useful to achieve that. Also, since Slack is and other tools are searchable, you also always have a way to trace back what has happened and what has led to what kind of discussion. However, you should not rely on people always being available on Slack, because then they won't necessarily be available to get their work done, especially for software development, but also in lots of other areas. You need to have time to actually focus on your real work that you have to deliver and not just be available on Slack. And the best way to achieve that is to make communication as asynchronous as possible. So don't rely on people being available, but just send out a message and expect there to be an answer. You can always follow up if there isn't one, but this way you don't get frustrated if people don't reply, and others don't have the opinion that they have to be online all the time to respond to your messages and not get their actual work done. As we're talking about tools already, having great tools available for video conferencing, for messaging, that's all great. But one problem that I've seen in a few companies is that they try out lots of different tools, and sometimes even the same team uses 2 different video conferencing software types, or you have different teams in the company using different tools, and then they cannot collaborate because one team cannot access the systems of the other. that gets really annoying really quickly. It's also really unmanageable. So if you already choose tools, try and choose one of each type to ensure that everybody can actually benefit from them. One thing that's linked to this is to try and give every tool and every channel a purpose. For example, use different Slack channels for a specific purpose, or only have video calls for certain types of events. This way, it becomes easy for people to decide, oh, I want to, for example, have our daily stand-up via video call. Well, we're going to use Zoom, or we're going to use Slack calls, or something else. On the topic of calls, I would highly recommend having regular video calls because it is much more effective in actually connecting a team and getting them on the same page. While you can achieve a lot with just email updates, and you can achieve a lot with memos and so on, video calls bring together people much more because you have a more personal interaction. And on top of that, you can also much more easily clarify misunderstandings and answer questions and go back and forth. However, at the same time, don't try and overdo it. You don't have to have a video call for everything. Try and write as much down as possible. But when there's an actual need for a video call, you should have one. Another thing on the topic of video calls, one thing that my current team I'm on is doing, and what I'm really enjoying, is to add some Slack to the schedule time for a video call, and whoever is available and feels in the mood can come online a few minutes earlier or stay on a bit longer. And we just have some chit-chat about day-to-day things. It's a great way to kind of break the ice between people. And I've had one of my colleagues in Arizona tell me about his 2 kittens who are 6 months old, and I get regular updates about what they're up to. And similarly from other of my colleagues, I hear about their day-to-day life. And as a fully remote team can sometimes be isolating, and you don't have these water cooler conversations, that's actually a great way to get the same benefit. And I feel like the entire team has come together a lot more because of it. As we're talking about meetings, one thing that probably a lot of companies already do, but that I find really useful, is having regular team meetings that all have agendas and that ideally follow some methodology, so you know what you're trying to do and trying to achieve in every single meeting. One of the development teams I'm on is using Scrum. It's fairly well known. It's an easy methodology. For those who don't know it, Scrum is essentially an agile methodology where you're working in sprints in a team that last about 2 weeks, and you're trying to achieve whatever work items you've selected to finish in that time. The good thing about Scrum is that it not only defines that abstract methodology, but it also gives you some direct pointers. You should, for example, have daily stand-ups. You should have once every sprint, you should have a sprint a retrospective, where you review how the last 2 weeks have gone, and where you not only discuss how the team has performed in achieving it, its actual work, but also how the work process, the Scrum process itself, has worked. And so this way, every 2 weeks, you get feedback on, how you're doing. And it doesn't matter whether you use Scrum or whether you use some other method. But if you have these regular review sessions, once every month, once every 2 weeks, and you discuss what is working well in your team and how you communicate and how you collaborate, then that's a great way to actually improve over time. One thing that Peter also touched upon is being aware of time zones. I mostly work with clients in the US, so I usually work in the evenings, which is fine. But if you have more distant time zones, it can be really, really tricky to get everybody on the same page. And that's especially a problem in companies that are partially on-site and partially remote, because then the on-site employees often forget to consider that other people are in other time zones. And if you're all in Europe or all in the US, it doesn't matter as much. But if you have a team that is partially in the US, partially in Europe, partially in Asia, partially in Australia, then that's going to be a lot more tricky. And there are great tools out there that actually allow you to visualize the time zones for your entire team, and thereby find scheduling find times that actually fit in everybody's schedule and that are not too inconvenient. Another tool I found quite useful to get started in onboarding is to create an interactive reference manual for employees or for contractors. Essentially, document everything about the processes and how you work, how you communicate as a company or as a team, and then make that available to everybody. If they just read through that, they will find all the answers they need to get started on day one. And similarly, even for employees who've been there for quite a long time, if it's a fairly comprehensive document, you will always be able to use this as a reference manual if you have any questions about anything that you don't have to do day to day. It's really useful. You definitely also have to always set the right expectations. This kind of goes back to, for example, the question of how quickly should you reply on Slack, or what kind of updates should you send. If you, as a remote freelancer or as a remote employee, speak with your clients or your manager or your team about what you expect from them and how you would like to work with them, and learn from them what they expect from you, you can be off to on a good start. And that's the best way to ensure that the entire collaborative process goes well. Linked to this is also some kind of manual. That's something that lots of companies have started doing, for example, Cockroach Labs. And that is, you should have a work with me manual. That's a small little document with 5 questions or something around that range that you select as a team, and then everybody responds to these and says, for example, how do you like to receive feedback? How do you like to be mentored? What kind of communication style do you prefer? And, for example, some trivia about yourself. If everybody has that and everybody's work with me profile is accessible, it's really easy to work with someone on a team that you haven't worked with before. It's really easy for new employees to understand how their team works and how individual contributors like to be worked with. And so it's really, really useful. As a manager, or also as a remote employee, you should make sure to always have one-on-ones. That's something that, again, in partially remote teams tends to be a problem. For on-site employees, it's fairly common to have one-on-ones to get performance reviews, to understand how everything is going. It's very easy to forget your remote workers there. And not many companies do this for freelancers. Ideally, a freelancer, especially if they are a regular contributor in your team, they will contribute like an employee. So you should also give them the same kind of feedback and opportunities that you give your employees. So that's something you shouldn't forget. A good way to get started with this, if you're not already working remotely or if your team isn't working remotely, a great way to get started with all of this is to introduce a working from home policy. Working from home is, even for just one day a week or one day every now and then, is a fantastic way to understand what it feels like to work remotely, to understand what the pain points are, what is working well, what is not working well, and then to keep on improving the process. It also makes it easy for your team to figure out what kind of remote workers they are comfortable working with, what is important to them and what isn't, before they actually get started and have a larger set of remote contributors. And finally, try and enjoy the entire process and keep on improving. Remote work can be a lot of fun, both for the team members that work remotely, but also for anyone else. You get to work with people from many different cultures. You can attract better talent from anywhere around the world, and that can just be a great creative boost for your entire team. And so why not try and go for it? And the good thing is, you can start today. I mean, as I said, there are many opportunities for non-remote teams to kind of get their feet wet and gain some experience in working remotely. And so if you're a manager, you can try and encourage your team to try out working from home. If you are a freelancer working with a client, you can try and structurally help them improve their communication skills and their processes and make them aware of this being an issue. And as an employee, you can also encourage the same thing. And so you should try and get started today if you're not already working on it. And the good thing is you can always improve, so try and do that. And that's it. That's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. And now, does anyone have any questions?